Hello Senior 1 students, we're going to take the grammar lesson of Unit 3, page 25. We're talking about modals for advice, obligation and prohibition. So let's take a look at the grammar. For advice, we use certain modals. These modals are should and ought to and had better. So we use should and ought to and had better to make recommendations and give advice. So these three modals are used either to make recommendations or to give advice. For example, you can say, it's really cold outside, you ought to wear a warm jacket. Or you should wear a warm jacket, or you had better wear a warm jacket. Now, the only difference is that after ought, you have to put to plus verb in the infinitive. But with should and had better, you put the verb in the infinitive without to. So here you are giving advice or you are making recommendations. In the negative form, with should, you say you shouldn't invite her to the wedding, so you put should plus not plus the verb in the infinitive. With had better, you have to say had better plus not plus forget plus to plus verb in the infinitive. So you say I had better not forget to invite her to the wedding. So you have to follow this form of the negative. It's a special form for had better. With ought to is not used in both the negative form or in the questions. What about questions? Should I call my parents? I have a problem. So again, you can use should in the affirmative form. You can use it in the negative form plus not, and you can use it in the question form. What about ought to and had better? Ought to and had better are not used in question forms. Okay. Then we have other modals that we use for obligation or necessity. We use must, have to, and need to talk about obligation in the present. But there is a difference between must and have to. We use must for personal obligation. The obligation comes from the speaker. It's not a law or rule. So for example, when I say you must see a doctor, you are very sick. So you must see a doctor, here it's a personal obligation. I am talking to my cousin, I see that he is sick, so I am telling him you must see a doctor. It's personal. It's not a rule or it's not a law. And of course here the obligation comes from the speaker. I am telling my cousin that he must see the doctor. I'm telling him you must see the doctor. What about have to? We use have to when we are talking about rules we are obliged to follow. The obligation comes from somebody else. So for example, I have to wear the uniform and be at school at 8 a.m. So here the obligation comes from somebody else and it's a rule or it's the law. So for schools, students have to wear uniform. The obligation comes from somebody else. It comes from the school. And it's a law or it's a rule. You cannot break the rule. Okay, so this is the difference between must and have to. Another example here, you can say workers have to wear overalls in the factory. So they have to wear overalls in the factory. It's the rule. And of course, the obligation comes from somebody else. These are the rules of the factory. The negative, we put the negative of need, needn't, and to be careful with needn't, you don't use to. So needn't without to. For example, I needn't drive fast, I am not in a hurry. With have to or has to, if you put has to, the negative is doesn't have to. Or if you put have to, the negative is don't have to. So doesn't have to or don't have to, we use them to talk about something that is not necessary. For example, I say she doesn't have to eat fish, she doesn't like it. So it's something that is not necessary. It's not important. She doesn't have to finish her meal. So it's not necessary to finish her meal. Then we have prohibition. For prohibition, we use mustn't to say something is not allowed. So for example, students mustn't eat in the classroom. So eating in the classroom is not allowed. It's prohibited. You mustn't touch the electricity. So of course, if you touch the electricity, you will die. So it's not allowed. It's prohibition. So after mustn't, you put the verb in the infinitive. Mustn't eat, mustn't touch. Questions, you put must plus verb in the infinitive. So for example, you can say, must you go to the doctor? And with have to, you say do plus have to plus the verb in the infinitive. So for example, do you have to go to school at 8 a.m.? With has to, you put does plus have to plus verb in the infinitive. For example, does she have to play tennis on Monday? The past four. We use had to talk about obligation in the past. Remember, we used have to in the present, but in the past form, we change have to into had to, and we use had to talk about obligation in the past. For example, I had to travel to Cairo because my grandfather died. The negative of had to is didn't have to plus verb in the infinitive. So they didn't have to travel to London. And the question form, you put did plus have to plus verb in the infinitive. So for example, you say, did they have to travel to London? Now let's go back to the book. And take a look at exercise 2. Look at the modal verbs and of course use some of the definitions with more than one modal verb. It isn't necessary. So if it isn't necessary, you put don't have to or needn't. Number 2, it's a recommendation. So you put should or ought to or had better. Number 3, it's a prohibition. you put mustn't. It's number 4, it's an obligation or necessity. So you can put have to, or must, or need. Now let me remind you again of the rules that we have mentioned before. Must and have to. Must and have to are both used to express obligation. When we decide an obligation for ourselves, we usually use must because we said it's used for personal obligations. So I must study this weekend if I want to pass the exam. We must visit our grandfather, he hasn't been well. So it's not a rule, it's personal. When the obligation comes from other people or organizations, then we often use have to. Why? Because it's a rule now. So the teacher said we have to do an exam this afternoon. Or motorcyclists have to wear a helmet. This is the rule. So the obligation comes from someone else or it comes from an organization. What about the difference between mustn't and don't have to? Although must and have to refer to obligation, mustn't and don't have to are very different in meaning. You mustn't speak when the headmaster is here means that it's prohibited. You are not allowed to do it. You mustn't do it. You're not allowed. But if I say you don't have to speak at the meeting, it means that it's not necessary to do it. You can if you want to, but it's not necessary. Okay? And this is the end of the lesson. Thank you.